the Torah goes out of its way, this is one of the fundamental beliefs of my life, to portray non-Jews positively and Jews negatively. It's one of the reasons I believe it's a divine author. If Jews had made up the Torah, they would have come across much more positively. They come across as awful, as a general rule. And non-Jews...
Generation of the Exodus from Egypt, we cannot compare ourselves to that generation. That generation was enslaved, living as slaves, and suddenly they have freedom. They're being chased by armies. They're being told that God is with them, but they're constantly having to believe that's the case. How would any of us react in that scenario? To say they were awful, compared to who? Are there criticisms? Sure. But hindsight's 20/20. You're living in the moment. What do you see? And I feel like this happens a lot, especially in Christian Bible studies, is that there's a very judgmentalness, a judginess that happens with the people that appear in the Tanakh. I'm not saying that we don't recognize when they've made their mistakes, but at the same time, I think we should have enough humility to recognize that we may not have done any better. In fact, we might have done worse. There's a story of a famous rabbi who was learning one night and came upon a difficulty in understanding a legal issue. And he decides to go to bed, and Menashe, the son of Hezekiah, appears to him in the dream, and he gives him the solution to his problem. And the rabbi says, "How can this be? You're a Russia. You're a wicked person. How can you? How are you such a great Torah scholar?" And he responds. The king responds back, and he says to him, he said, "If you lived in my day," he said, "you would have picked up the hems of your garment to chase after idolatry." We can't really appreciate what they went through, what the pressures were that they were experiencing, spiritual, physical, mental, other, whatever that they experienced, and to just label them as awful, I think that's wrong. We should have respect and we should have humility, and recognize that we're looking at this from 3,300 years later.
Well, that's certainly what Solzhenitsyn thought about the Nuremberg trials. Is he believed that the fact that the Nazi atrocities were regarded as wrong, independent of cultural context. He thought that was a signal achievement of the 20th century because it reestablished not so much the existence of good, but definitely the existence of evil. And that was something I found unbelievably convincing, because I thought, well, you've got a real conundrum here. It's like, was what the Nazis did evil or not? Because those are the alternatives. And if it wasn't, it's like, okay, well, you can move ahead on that presumption, or you can accept that it was evil in a transcendent sense, because that's what the Nuremberg trials were about. And then the terrible implication of that, in some sense, is that if evil genuinely exists, then its opposite genuinely exists, because it's not going to exist without its opposite. And so as soon as you accept the reality of the evil of Auschwitz, you're in a metaphysical world in some sense, because you have to simultaneously posit the existence of a transcendent good that's at least the opposite of that.
I really love this discussion. I love this discussion here because it's very interesting, and it's relevant to when we talk to people about whether or not there's a God, and having discussions with atheists, and even with ourselves. I think it's a very critical point, very good point that they're making here. But it's still a rabbit trail. Like we've sort of wandered off from the study of Exodus, and we're on this rabbit trail. And we haven't learned a lot about Exodus. We've learned a lot about transcendence, themes of power and tyranny, and a lot of other things. Dennis, the one thing I can say for them is he keeps trying to bring it back to the text, where everybody else is bringing it to philosophy and psychology and whatever. Although the art guy did a pretty good job. He had a good observation, but I think he fumbled the ball towards the end.
Well, you could say, I suppose, that if theists are faced with the problem of evil, atheists are confronted with the problem of good, trying how to make sense of goodness, how to make sense of what it is that drives their moral indignation and their great social revolutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. Theist versus atheist, for sure. There's the issue of good. It's something I've asked atheists a number of times. Why are you good? Why is it so important to be good? And I think that Judaism, we have a concept that we have an evil inclination, we have a good inclination. And what that means is that in order to have free will, we have to have free choice, and we have to have, and having free choice means we have to have free desire, and we have to desire something. So do we desire the good? Do we desire God? Or do we desire evil? Do we desire hedonism? What are we desiring? And that's a constant issue that we face. So yeah, I think for sure that's a good question to ask atheists. But we're still not at the text. We're still not we're still not talking about what's going on in the text.
One of the most terrifying moments in the Nuremberg trials was when the Nazis advanced the defense that this was simply victor's justice, that they had not really broken any laws. They were scrupulous legislators, after all. And
following orders.
That's right. And so sort of Western notions of justice found themselves staring into the abyss. How is it that we're going to make sense of our deep intuition that this is evil of an absolute kind? And I think this is one of the great, as a matter of historical fact, one of the most important motivating.
And that's what we have, is the instinct of good. I think comes from our Yetzirah Hatov, our good inclination, that there is a part of us that wants to be good. It wants to pursue God. It wants to pursue spirituality. And that is why we have revulsion of certain ideas. And I think that what happens when you become an atheist is that morality becomes even more difficult, infinitely more difficult than even if you believe in a horrible religion sometimes. At least there's a certain level of certainty. There's at least, a certain level of, well, this is, there are certain things that are definitely good. There are certain things that are definitely evil. But come on, guys, let's get to the text.
Is there anything more real than pain, suffering, and cruelty? And the answer would be yes, that which can transcend those three things. And it could easily be that you cannot make contact with what transcends those without diving deep into the nature of those, as deep as possible. And I certainly see the biblical narrative focusing, for example, on the crucifixion, but not only that, as the collective.
Right, because we're reading into the text of the Hebrew scriptures, the New Testament scriptures. So therefore, you already have this ideology, this belief system that's created in the New Testament. And then obviously, because there's a Hebrew scriptures, or what Christians call an Old Testament, it must be that the themes we find in the New Testament must pre-exist in the Old Testament, because it's one whole story. Unfortunately, when you read the text by itself, it's just not true. And that the New Testament theology has nothing to do with the Hebrew theology, because it's its own thing. Christian theology is its own thing, and Judaism is its own thing. And I think if we come to the common ground and we examine the text, let it speak for itself, I think that becomes clear. But this habit of constantly reading into the text our ideas about transcendence and philosophy and political ideologies and all this kind of information, it's interesting for sure, and I love those discussions. But when it's coming to learn from the Torah, what's God have to say, we've got to take those things and put them to the side and just listen. What is the text trying to say? And we're not doing that. We are 49 minutes into the study, almost an hour into the study, 50 minutes. And I think we've spent a good 40 minutes talking about not the text. What the text causes us to think about from our own fields of disciplines, from our own, from the things we like to think about, or from our own ideas, right? But not the text itself. What this group really needs, they need like a rabbi to sit in here and keep everybody on track and go back to the text, go back to the text. You can't learn anything this way. I mean, you can learn about philosophy, but if you want to have a discussion of philosophy, right, Why call it an Exodus study? Why have a Bible in front of you? Take philosophy, politics, all those elements that you talk about, and can have that conversation any time in your life when you want to. And I'm not saying it's not related to what the Torah has to say, but recognize that it doesn't have something in common with what the Torah has to say. Maybe the Torah has a different message from the things that you deal with on a daily basis. Take those elements, put them to the side, listen to the text.